I'm Howard Hall. I'm the director of the Institute for Nuclear Security with the University of Tennessee. I'd like to welcome you all here. We have one of our brown bag sessions. This is probably our best attended of the year so far. The Institute is a collaboration between the university, Oak Ridge National Lab, Y-12 National Security Complex, and Oak Ridge Associated Universities. And ORL was gracious enough to host this one since we knew there would be a lot of interest up here in the Oak Ridge area. So first of all, welcome. Second, of course, since we're in one of the federal facilities, in the event of emergency, run out those doors. That's pretty much it. So please don't trip while doing so.
Right.
So our speaker today is Frank Munger. Frank is a University of Tennessee graduate. So hoorah for the Big Orange. How many Big Orange folks do we have here? That's a remarkably small number for most rooms that I'm in these days. Frank is a longtime reporter. He's a senior staff member with the Knoxville News Sentinel. He is also the author of the widely read Atomic City Underground blog. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit about his experiences covering Y-12. Frank?
Try that dramatically long walk, thinking you'd be, just be cascading and continuing. Does this automatically just pick up? Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me fine?
No, maybe use the microphone.
I'll turn this. There is no microphone.
I think you just have to speak loudly.
Okay, I'll speak loudly, but it's what if I walk, it's going to be. Okay, I'll talk loud.
Do you have a little microphone?
If I carried one with me, it still wouldn't work, I don't think. Anyway, I consider myself sort of an optimist. Every morning when I go to work, I usually put a few unpaid bills in my pocket, some to-do lists, maybe the grocery or a few other things, in hopes of getting some things done at work that I didn't get done at home. Conversely, every evening when I leave work, I usually take my briefcase and a stack of papers that's about like this, desperately in hope that I'll get some things done at home that I didn't get done at work. I was talking to a friend who considers himself sort of a life coach, and let's just say he said to me, and how's that working for you? And suggested that wasn't really the definition of optimism. Yesterday I had a chance to spend a little time with Bruce Held, who's the interim Undersecretary, Department of Energy for Nuclear Security, and also the acting administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration. And he said, gosh, you're funny. I thought, that's not the kind of thing you can put on your resume. I started out here, as you guys can see, it's kind of become a common symbol. It's kind of a mixed message. I get a lot of mixed messages, sort of a welcome, and then I kind of have felt that way at times, that I'm sort of getting the welcome, and Lee can certainly compensate that. He's giving mixed messages in the past. I want to give a little bit of a background. I managed to offend somebody just with this title. I think as soon as that came out from Howard and put that out there, someone from Y-12 said, "Well, you're no piece of cake either." That was kind of a mixed metaphor too. But anyway, I said, "Okay." I said, "Gosh, instead of worrying, I've already offended some people." Both of my parents worked on the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge. They were married in 1945. This was taken in the house of, I forgot forgot his name now, who headed recreation. Anyway, the photographs were taken by Ed Westcott, my parents' wedding photographs, and he was an incredible gentleman and later delivered those to me, gave me the negatives for all the photographs, and I treasure those and to this day, and am very appreciative of that. I grew up in Maryville, but we always passed through here because I had relatives who my grandparents who lived in Oliver Springs outside here, so we always passed through Oak Ridge, and I always heard about Oak Ridge, but there was never any destiny about me working or covering doing what it is I do. In fact, it was the oddest thing that years later, even though I was familiar with my parents' work and that they'd spent time here, and I had a number of relatives who said they worked at the plant and had no idea which plant it was. And to this day, some of them, I don't know what plant they worked at, but they just worked at the plant. But that was just sort of an odd thing, one of those things that I eventually came to cover these facilities. Most of you here don't need this, but I know there are some people perhaps here who do. So I'm going to do the obligatory little bit of Y12's history because I'm going to be talking a little bit about Y12. I'm not going to be the standard speaker who will read my PowerPoint presentation, so that I'll let you guys do that if there's anything that needs the explanation. The reference to kaboom, I think most people know what that means if you know what the secondaries are. And again, early, not so early, but early.
With a mustache.
Yes, there was and brown hair. Oh wait, that's in black and white. But I always like to keep a few of those around, and so it shows that I haven't always had gray white hair. Although I did start going gray in my 20s. And I guess I had a little bit going on there. The sign, more famous now than ever. Another sign. What I want to talk about a little bit today, first off, I want to spend some time eventually talking about coverage of the July 28, 2012 break-in at Y12. I'm going to deal with that. But first I want to talk just a little bit about Y12, openness, newspapers, covering it. I've done it for a long time, more than 30 years. A book came out. I don't know if I have that. I don't. I got it in a later slide, but I'll show that. A book came out a few years ago. It's called A Nuclear Family Vacation. I'm going to give me a... Oh, there you go.
Put it in your pocket right now.
Okay.
Put it way up, please. Oh, way up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. No, don't put it on that.
Don't?
Yeah, it'll work very well there.
We have a difference of opinion here.
It's fact, we just took the measurement.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
A book came out a few years ago called A Nuclear Family Vacation. Boy, this is amplified now. Is that too loud?
No.
No, okay. It was funny, it was written by Nathan Hodge and Sharon Weingarten. And one of the advantages or disadvantages of being around for a long time is people call you and they want to know things, and they want to sort of tap your head and see if you remember this or who you know, or give them direction on how they might go about doing that. And I can tell you there's an awful lot of people out there right now doing documentaries. It seems like I get a call about every other week from somebody doing a documentary who wants me to point them in the right direction. Anyway, one of the authors called me back before 2008 and just asked me a few things about Y12. So I told him and talked a little bit about it. And funniest thing when the book came out, of course I did first thing is always go check the index, see if your name's in there. And it was quoting a local reporter saying at Y12, this is the family that went all around the complex and also even abroad and visited all these nuclear weapon sites and talked about the secrecy and different things. And anyway, he had written that I'd said something to the effect of back in the early days when I was covering it, this which had been probably the beginning in the early 80s, things were so difficult that I had to use an intermediary to deliver my questions to Y12 in hopes of getting a response. And I remember when I read that, I thought, what on earth does that mean? Because it was exactly the reverse of what I'd actually explained to him. I was actually saying at that time that it was actually easier in many ways to get information out of Y12 back in the 80s than it was in the current day. And that's still true. I don't want to glorify or make the 80s sound like they were easy. It wasn't challenging. It was. It always has been. It's a national security facility. There's a lot of classified information. There's a lot of secrets. There are a lot of requirements. But it is. There's a lot of difficulties today that didn't exist back in the day. People forget, I think, how Y12 is, if they ever knew, how much Y12 has changed over the years. When I first started covering this facility as part of my Oak Ridge coverage, you could actually drive on Bear Creek Road from one end to the other. I mean, you could, if you wanted to go to K25 and take a shortcut, you just drove down Bear Creek Road, hit 95, and you were on your way. Yes, there was a sign there that said you shouldn't do that, but everybody in the world did do that. That sign there, the saying, whatever, no trespassing, and all the impact of a do not litter sign. People just did it, and it was open, and everybody knew that. That changed around 1983, 84, when they started putting in a lot of physical barriers. That was back in the time when they started doing pop-up barriers, which they later removed. And I think they put back in. But they even started creating hedges with thorns and doing a number of other physical measures. That was the first time I think we saw concertina wire. They built new guard towers. In fact, after they did close the road officially, and that first morning, the story is, and Joe LeGrun likes to tell, Joe LeGrun was the DOE manager back then, that first morning when they put dumpsters on a makeshift way out on Bear Creek Road, the first one to come along about 5 o'clock that morning was some guy hauling a bass boat on his way to the lake, and was more than a little surprised to see a dumpster in the middle of Bear Creek Road. Actually, I guess there were several of those dumpsters. To keep them. I remember at the time, we also took notice of that in the building of security at Lot 12. And I remember a photographer, and I won't name his name, because at the time I said, could you maybe get some photographs of these new guard towers they're constructing on Bear Creek Road? And he said, what's the catch? And I said, well, they don't want you to. So he said, well, I don't want my credit line on there then, so I won't share that today. But we did get the photographs of these new guard towers that were under construction. Again, they had guard towers before, but they'd pretty much taken down. This was a whole time in which the Department of Energy had decided, of course this is pre-National Nuclear Security Administration, this is back when the Department of Energy did, within its defense programs, in Oak Ridge, they managed the Y-12 through the defense programs, but the ultimate authority came out of Albuquerque. The 1980s were a lot about the environment. As I show you here, we had a change of contractors. That was a huge deal when the contractor managed all of these facilities, and at that time they were all combined into one. When Union Carbide Nuclear Division left, and when the contract ultimately was won by Martin Marietta Energy Systems, they took over in 1984. There were a lot of things to cover back then. And I think as I'm showing here, in 1983, you had a guard strike at Y-12 and at ORNL. They were both under the International Guards Union of America, IGUA number 3. It only lasted 2 weeks because the International Union had discussions with the Department of Energy, and they were ordered back to work for national security reasons. But a few years later, in 1987, you had the longest strike in Oak Ridge history. I spent covering it the entire summer. One of my strong favorite memories, because it gave me a chance in Oak Ridge to know the hourly workers, and that has proved really important over the years to have a relationship with the people who work at these facilities, if not at the management level. Also, most people were familiar in 1980s also brought the revelations about mercury contamination. People learned that what had taken place years before. Many people had no idea there had even been a mercury use in Y12. They always thought it was just radioactive materials. And so when the creek, in November 1982, when the creek was posted as a hazard because of mercury pollution, a whole slew of questions were raised. And of course, a few months later, when the release and the declassified documents showing just how much mercury was unaccounted for, I think everybody was a little bit stunned, even those who had actually worked at the plant during that period. But what I want to say was, even at that time, when there was a lot of things going on, Y12 wasn't a total closed shop in terms of its information flow. Unlike the sort of this brief reference in this book, the fact that it was impossible to get any and send emissaries or intermediaries in to ask your questions for you, it was sort of a normal process as it is today. In fact, I'm actually probably some of the work I'm proudest of having done in Oak Ridge over the past 30 plus years had to do with simply detailing the work that takes place at Y12, not just what they do, but how they do it, the types of missions, weapon introductions. I mean, it was surprisingly that kind of information had really not been disseminated on a local basis. These are things that were talked about in Congress, but many of the people who lived even in this area, or some of the people who even worked at these facilities, didn't know in great detail the kinds of missions that Y12 was carrying out. And I thought that was important. I thought it was important that if the people can talk about this before congressional committees for appropriations, then certainly the people who work at these plants deserve to have that same sort of knowledge. I can't say that everyone agreed with me on that sort of thought. I did hear from some people there was some hate mail. There were people who accused me of aiding and abetting the enemies, of basically breaching classification. And of course, one of the things we had done was we had attempted to bump up against classification to actually test it and see where the boundaries are. I don't know how I should cover national security facilities for that without seeing what the parameters are in terms of what you can and you can't cover. But the process of security education over decades had basically stopped, in a conservative way, as it rightly should be, I suspect, is to leave a lot of room in that buffer. And so people were surprised to see some of this stuff in print and couldn't believe that it was actually being given out, because they were just basically saying, don't say anything. Back then also, you would see releases that Y12 was fairly, I won't say particularly forthcoming, but they were fairly reasonable. This was the time of environmental scandals across the Department of Energy complex. Mercury certainly was a huge deal here, but there were other issues as well. And Y12 was fairly forthcoming in terms of things at the time, because that was what the Department of Energy was doing. They were trying to be a little bit more open about the environmental issues. I was looking at this, and one thing I did bring here, this is, I didn't have it on electronics, so I was showing here. This is a little photograph which I gave my mother once. If you can imagine giving your mother a photograph if you had a nuclear waste dump. I never understood why she was never that keen about it. I mean, I thought I was giving her a photograph of me at work. And this was taken in the Bear Creek Burial Grounds. This is what used to be called, I always find this kind of interesting, this is what they called trenches. Now, if you visited these sites when they were in operation, when they used dump trucks to stuff a cascade down these walls, I've said in the past, the other times, these weren't trenches, these were canyons. I mean, these were really big places. I mean, you can see the color's sort of fading now, but you can see the green water in the bottom of this, and that's basically your low-level radioactive waste melting and mixing right there with the groundwater. That is the state of Tennessee's groundwater right there, and that was what the state of Tennessee told the Department of Energy. But this was the first time this had truly been kind of, in fact, this was just before, as I recall, this photograph was taken just before the congressional hearing that was held here in 1983, a field hearing. It was co-chaired by then Congressman Al Gore Jr. and Marilyn Lloyd, who had decidedly different aspects. But that they co-chaired this hearing was kind of an amazing sort of thing, because they had very different views of what the Department of Energy was doing. Anyway, Second. So that was a change. Let me go back here. The 90s. The 90s were kind of a mixed thing for me. There were huge deals in the 80s and in the 2000s. The 1990s were sort of an interesting time. It was a lot of attention to the cleanup of the things that had been discussed in the 1980s, started being put into play in the 1990s. A lot of layoffs, post-Cold War period coming up. I remember Bob Hart, who was a former DOE manager, after he retired, he told me once, he said, you know, and he meant this in the most honest, earnest way, what Mark Marietta does best is lay off people. And he really meant that in a positive way. It was that force, given this really difficult challenge of having to reduce the workforce, they managed to do it in a relatively humane way and help the people find jobs. And to be honest, I could never tell the difference in terms of the overall work population. It seemed to me that they took all these workers who worked at the plants, and they somehow dispersed them and became subcontractors and got I never could get the numbers to show me the true loss. Project Sapphire, that was another thing in the 1990s. I was telling someone a story, and I was going to go back there. Oh yeah, that was on the other one. The Cold War secrets. That was actually a really cool anecdote I was going to tell, but I talked to one of my editors this morning, and he asked me not to. Actually, there were two sort of things, and I realized that I probably should run a couple of these things past, because there was one thing I'd never actually discussed publicly, so I'm not going to do it, but I'm not really trying to tease you with it either, but it was something I intended to talk about that I'd never really talked about before, and so anyway. So this, but back onto this, the Project Sapphire, there's another one. I assume most of you may be familiar with the 1994 Project Sapphire, in which I think the number was 600 kgs of HEU that was brought from Kazakhstan to here. After a long and arduous effort over a period of time from a lot of Y-12 workers in terms of getting it ready for the transfer to here. It was a big deal. It was one of the biggest covert actions and one of the most celebrated covert actions in recent peace times, and certainly the post-Cold War era. There's a story about that in the sense that before that came out, I received information about Project Sapphire, and I knew the name. Actually, I knew the name of it. And there was a meeting. I still remember it. I should have called up and talked to these people before I came here and spoke today. But I remember the Oak Ridge leadership, the Department of Energy, was having one of these things where they went before Oak Ridge City Council. And I don't know what it was for. It was some obligatory thing where they were supposed to go and listen and then say something. And outside there was a break on one of the side porches, and I think it was Joe LeBrun was out there as the DOE manager, and I think there was maybe Bill Bidd, who may have been the defense. I can't remember what the titles were at that particular time, because some of these people held multiple titles. But they were just talking. They were probably out there smoking cigarettes. People did that back then. Maybe me, I don't know. But I remember I went up to Joe and I said, so what can you tell me about Project Sapphire? And I don't know, he sort of got a really strange look on his face and didn't really say anything. And he said, we'll get back to you on that. There was a sense, there was a sudden tone change. Things changed, and they did get back with me, but he didn't. It was a bunch of people out of Washington got back with me, and they immediately started screaming at me. Well, I say screaming. They were very strong tones were elevating their voice, and immediately telling me that if I did anything, if I did this, that, or option C, that I was risking the lives of a number of people who were in a vulnerable position and whatever else. And to be honest, and this was the case at the time, to be honest, I really didn't know beans about Project Sapphire, except I had the name and the only barest inkling of what even the project was that I was trying to learn, which is what you do, and so I didn't tell them I didn't know anything. But it continued to escalate over a couple of days which I only learned recently. This is an odd, sort of one of those odd things that you hear about later. I was talking to Tom Behan, Oak Ridge Mayor Tom Behan, the other day, and Tom and his wife used to work for the Cincinnati Post, the Scripps newspaper, same as Change. He knew Bill Burley, who was one of the top dogs in all the Scripps, and I didn't realize this, but Bill Burley was telling Tom about that story. He mentioned my name or something, and I know the employer. And I didn't realize at the time that the Department of Energy also called and got hold of the head of Scripps to try to force non-publication. Anyway, this was a very short period. Before I could ever get anything going or even make the decision, we would have certainly had to make a decision on these kinds of things once if we learned more about it. We never had to make that decision because we didn't have enough information to publish a story, except for the title. But it was one of my strong memories, not the only one by any stretch, a strong memory of people calling, begging, threatening, et cetera, that's not to run a certain story. And I felt a little bit irritated about it because once they managed to get the people on safe turf, they could care less about us, and they held the big shindig in Washington D.C. and of course we had our Washington correspondent there, but they didn't really care what I knew then because they were bragging like heck about it. There's a story which I lifted from a Y-12 report of the photograph that was taken in Kazakhstan at what must have been just one strange facility, just basically a warehouse with a lock and a chain link fence outside. Again, I'm going to just show this for continuity of just what goes on today. I think most people know that who are in this room. This is a little bit where I wanted to get into just some of the differences, what's taking place, because I don't know fully what's happened. In recent years, there's been a huge change in terms of the availability of information at Y-12. There's been a greater limits on access. There have been incredible delays in getting information. What used to take would give a same-day response on basic information now took days. It didn't just go it wasn't just in Oak Ridge, it was going to Washington on a regular basis. It's been a very challenging thing just in the past few years. It's more challenging than ever to try to cover this. Most responses now come via sanitized emails. I haven't, over the past year, continuous requests, well, let's just put it in this context. Since July 28, 2012, I've asked repeatedly for interviews with top leaders at the National Nuclear Security Administration and at the contractor B&W Y-12, and the grand total of those granted and given was, until yesterday, 0. That's unusual. Let me define that. I did at a couple of conferences follow people to the restroom, and when they came out, asked them a question as they reemerged. I found that to be one of the great things about ATIBA conferences, that they have people in big long corridors, and people have to go a long way. And say, I'm sorry, I know it's an awful strategy, but sometimes you have to do what you do. I did not do any restroom interviews. I didn't wait for them to come out. And if I shook their hand, I hope they washed. But there were no interviews. I mean, I said yesterday I had a chance. It wasn't the interview. It certainly wasn't the interview I requested. Had an interview with Bruce Held, who's an intelligence officer by background. He's the director of the Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. He's not the person I was looking for to give you the details or the background of what took place during the past year at Y-12 regarding following up the incident in which you had 3 Plowshares protesters break into the plant. You know the story. And this wasn't that unusual, except that for it to go a year was an extraordinary thing. I think back, and let's just go ahead and just say here, I want to think back that even during the Cold War, during the last period, say those early 80s, where during the last period in the Reagan administration, the last big weapons buildup that we had in the United States, they were still giving interviews at Y-12. One of the ones I think about is when sitting down in a room, just sitting down with in a room with Jeff Bostock, who was the general manager of programs at Y-12 at the time, later managed the Paducah Gaseous Fusion Plant. He was joined there by Ken Brady, who was a Georgia Tech grad, who was the manager of the MX program, which later became the Peacekeeper. And I was trying to think this morning. I can't think that Carl, maybe somebody in this room knows it. Carl, whatever, who headed the Trident II program. They had two weapons production programs coming online. And when we sat in the room and we talked, and they knew the boundaries of classification. They obviously were comfortable with that. We discussed it. We talked about the programs coming online, what they were doing within the plant to prepare for these weapons production programs. And we went about it, and it was cordial, and we went about it. And it was okay. I flash back years later, probably the last, I guess, I'm trying to think of maybe one of the, see if I can find it here, one of the last real sit-down interviews that I've had at Y-12 was probably a couple of years ago with Bill Russ, the vice president, who's steeped with defense programs in his background, although he switched now to ES&H, I believe. He was joined there with Brian Gullett, who was heading the dismantlement program. And this room setup was a little bit different than what it used to be, or it showed how times have changed. I called it sort of the ping pong interview. It's because I was sitting. I was sitting at the far end of the table. It was a fairly long table. I was sitting at one end of the table with Bill and with Brian, and then there was a public affairs person sitting in the middle there. And then on down at this other end, this must have been 20 feet long. Down at the other end, there were two classification officers. And so every time I would ask a question down here, and Bill would look at Brian, they would look at me, and then we all collectively would turn this way, and they would go, and when they could answer it. I mean, seriously, not a single question was answered directly. It was all da da da. And this went on for quite a ways. Now, there was the yes, and there was the no, and then there was a term I'd never heard before, and that was called putting in the parking lot.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Ted, do you know what that means? Sure. Okay, I didn't know. It's a term I'd never heard. The parking lot was where they would put. They said, "Well, we'll put that in the parking lot," and that meant they were going to. That means they weren't sure whether they could talk about it or not, and they would determine that later. And so at some point during the interview, this interesting thing, they left me with my escort and left me in the room, and they all went to some other to a classified room, to a safe room, where they could discuss the answers or whatever. And they came back, and it was actually fairly efficient within the scope of this, as to how they went about doing their business. And I think when they came back, I think there were 4, 5, 6 maybe items in the parking lot, and they came back, and I think I got 4 of the 6 or 3 of the 6. It was at least got at least half of this. I was made to feel pleased. Some of the others may have just been a front. I mean, they probably had to turn down some just thing. But so that's a difference. Now, what caused the difference? You know, the world has changed over the length of time that I've covered these facilities. Contractors have changed. Lots of things have changed. A big difference was 9/11. No question about it. 9/11 was huge. It changed everything. For a while, it turned O&L into a mini Y-12. I meant that in the most flattering way. You know, that was a big deal, and we all knew that. Yeah. Do I think, I'm a newspaper reporter for gosh sakes, do I think that people ever take advantage of a national security situation, whatever else, to simply withhold and not speak about things they simply don't want to talk about? Yes, I do. Now, another big things have come, and that was the July 28, 2012 break-in. That was a big deal too. But I have to say that hasn't been, I don't think, the huge deterrent. If anything, information has been more freely given during the past year, but it wasn't because they gave any interviews or whatever. What I told us because there's been a huge flow of investigation reports. There's been a lot of people talking, but it hasn't been necessarily the plant discussing it. A big deal because there's got a contract situation going on, which has been going on for a long time. And that's probably playing a safety factor in why people don't want to talk about this, that, and everything else. But the biggest impact for me, undoubtedly, was the 2005 termination of Dennis Ruddy as general manager at Y-12. That's difficult to talk about in a completely factual way because the National Nuclear Security Administration and its contractors have never fully confirmed what took place, except that it was, I think the statement was that they did confirm basically that he lost his security clearance. And I've written about this, and again, like I said, there's no confirmation on all the details of it, but it would seem clear that it was based that Dennis Ruddy was terminated from Y-12 and moved on because he breached classification and lost his security clearance for those reasons. He did so probably in at least 2 interviews with me, as I'm told, and it made life very difficult in terms of what proceeded afterwards. There were a lot of other factors involved in there. I'm not privy to the absolute details on all of those. There certainly have been reports that, and there was in this last interview, which had to do with this. Multiple interviews had to do with the centrifuge and other equipment that was brought from Libya to Y-12. And the impression I have, again, that it was without any confirmations that there were some things said and that were perhaps published that breached what he was supposed to be talking about, and maybe on more than one occasion. There's reports that he was warned beforehand about some of these and didn't do it. It is my understanding also that during the last interview in 2005, before his departure, was that he had specifically turned down apparently having a derivative classifier in the room or having a classification officer in the room because he reportedly, I don't know this to be absolute fact, had not been pleased by some interruptions during an earlier time. Anyway, that didn't make it any easier. In fact, that made it very difficult. From that point on, we've seen the exchange of information coming out of Y-12 to be, pretty tight, pretty, let's just say, very scrutinized. Like I said, almost everything does now come by email. I think if I were to ask someone today, what is the name of that little creek that starts in the middle of Y-12 and flows through much of Oak Ridge, I think they'd probably have to take about 3 days to come back and confirm that was the East Fork Poplar Creek. Because I'm serious, even the simplest of questions don't come back the same day. And maybe this was a spoiled standard. Maybe this dates back to a time when the news media was much more important before people realized maybe they could self-publish and do the same thing themselves. But things definitely changed. It's just not any easier. But you learn to work with everything. I'm thankful in many ways that we have reports coming out from the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, that you have the occasional GAA report or Inspector General report, because those contain information many times with a considerable lag time about what's taking place inside Y-12. And if they didn't, I don't know that these things would ever be released. Y-12 once upon a time would have news release, or at least some sort of news advisory when somebody was hurt at the plant or when there had been a significant spill. You don't see that anymore. It has to come out. You almost have to see it in another report to even ask for confirmation on it. They simply don't release the thing. Almost all of the press releases have to do with And there, I won't say, this is not absolute. There are the occasions. There are the occasional releases, news releases, not other releases, that do come out of the plant. But for the most part, they're, meat recycling goals, safety standards, safety barbecue. They just, those, giving to charities. They're just, it's not really the kind of news. And I like that news. That's important. I post it all the time. But it's not the kind of news you look for. You certainly expect if somebody gets splashed with a chemical and their face is burned in a significant way, you would think that an institution would release information on that. But that hasn't happened. So that's sort of discouraging from my standpoint. It's disappointing. We all try to work around whatever obstacles or challenges or plays. I have not done as good a job as I might have done in terms of just looking for alternative ways. I found myself increasingly having to use the Freedom of Information Act to ask for basic things. I know, and some people have told me they were shocked or surprised the fact that I had to provide a FOIA request to get the National Nuclear Security Administration and BMW Y-12 to release their management teams. Someone said that was unprecedented, and I don't disagree. The fact that I certainly got it, they knew that was going to be the case. But what you do in these cases, and that's the problem with filing things through FOIA, is that there's almost an automatic delay, and it can be abused, and it has been abused. People can use that. Many times there are institutions, contractors, companies that will use that in order to delay the release of information to the point where it's no longer meaningful, or who cares at some point for so long. The average length of time is it's not speedy. So if they say, well, it's not releasable, and you have to FOIA that, well, if you get it a month later, they said it may be almost irrelevant. But you still do it, and I haven't done it often enough. Because really back in the day, and I will say back in the day, and I don't know when that might have been 2000, that might have been 1987, I don't know. But at the time, there was a thought, and there was an open process where the Department of Energy basically said, we will look at that, or we know these things. If it's available through the Freedom of Information Act, we're going to give it to you now. We're not going to force you through the request, which is only the right thing to do. But that doesn't take place, and certainly doesn't take place today. I'm not angry. Just disappointed. This is me. This was a little incident that occurred at the grand opening of the highly enriched uranium materials facility. The freshly painted HUMF. When it was done, this was an event. It was a big event. I think the Secretary of Energy was here. A lot of people were here. We went through, because this is in the protected area, there obviously were some restrictions and a lot of preparatory thing for getting hundreds of people inside there so they could sit right next to this big new facility. And of course, the news media, we certainly don't get any special treatment in that regard. I think we get watched at least as closely as the average VIP. But this one pissed me off. I've been around a long time, and I've been through a lot of security checks and a lot of sign-ins, and I've been asked a lot of stupid things, and I've been, said it was a requirement. I had a guy at Fernald once. I was checking in at the Fernald plant in Ohio. I was registering there. We were doing stories on uranium back in the 80s, and I was checking in, and I signed into the guest book or the visitor's log. Guest book makes it sound a little. Guest book makes it sound like never mind. And I signed in, and they were waiting on me because I was visiting 5 uranium facilities in a week, and so I was going from Paducah and Portsmouth and Fernald and I don't know where else, and I was doing stories on uranium. This is the mid-80s. Anyway, I was signing in, and you had to put your name, of course, and I don't remember what else information. They used to have to do more information. And then you got to citizenship. And they weren't happy to have me, let's just put it that way. They weren't happy to have me anyway. And I ran into this at Paducah as well because it was a tough time. It was a tough time for all of the DOE complex when this environmental scandal was really just breaking. And they really didn't want to hear it. But anyway, so the guy checking me in, I'm signing in, and he looks at me, he looks at my thing, and he says, well, you didn't sign there, and under citizenship I put U.S. And here I said, he said, that's not good enough. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, it could be USSR. And I said, so I appropriately, I didn't know nobody else had done it, but I appropriately added a USA to mine, and I got in. We ran into all sorts of sort of intimidation things. At Paducah once, we were told we were 3/4 of a mile from the plant or at a nuclear waste facility, and we're looking back at the plant, and they stopped our photographer, was going to snap a photograph. If you've been to Paducah, especially back in the day, it's a corrugated aluminum thing that says Paducah Gas Diffusion Plant on the side. We're going to shoot a photograph. We wanted to be able to shoot this way so you can actually get the waste thing with the plant in the background for identification purposes. Obviously, it makes sense if you're a photographer. But we argued for an hour before they would finally let us do that, because they were saying that's for security reasons. They just were being antagonistic. Back to this. I checked in. We went through normal procedures. I'm not trying to get away with anything, for gosh sakes. But anyway, we were going through the normal checks. I was with Terry Marler, who heads the whole thing for the house, and this is him there with me. And he was personally with me. I was one-on-one. He says, come this way. At one point, I took my camera out of my pocket, put it on the table there where things should be done. I said, no, not yet. No, not yet. We're going to do whatever else. Well, that was the last that came of it. Everybody else, all the news media, got onto this other van where they loaded all the equipment, whatever. Carrie says, come with me. I did exactly what I was asked to do. And so we drove separately, just the two of us, onto the far side, or to the west side, over to the highly enriched uranium materials facility. As soon as we got out, I opened the door, got the camera out, and started shooting photographs. Well, that apparently was noticed by more than a few people. They wondered why the rest of the meeting was over there scrambling to get their TV cameras and everything else out of the van, and I was over there shooting photographs. Well, the impression was, and the treatment was that I had somehow violated some rule, which I hadn't. And for God's sakes, I wasn't forgot all the entire time. But they had to check me and make sure that I had not some way taken photographs, I guess during the pass through as a protected area. And those of you who have been there, and to be honest, I don't know what there would be to shoot, but I don't know what kind of secrets I could have gotten. But I understand the rules. But the fact is, the fact that you get this sort of reverse treatment, it's your fault that, as I said, it pissed me off. And I still don't, and the part that really gets me is not the fact that it did it, but the fact that it's still held against me in that regard. There's still people out there who think I tried to get away with something there, to shoot photographs. It turns out, they looked, I hadn't taken it, every single photograph on the thing was taken after the van landed. Anyway, so much about that. What I said, when I talked about the later, the ping pong interview and everything else, a lot of that I think does emanate from the fact that Dennis Ruddy said things that he should not have said to a newspaper reporter. It got published. Obviously because the entire plant was ordered not to say a word, and I mean literally threatened. It was there was notice put out that they were threatened with the loss of their jobs if anyone spoke of that issue whatsoever. So it put a chill, to say the least, and also I think created a virtual book. There may be an actual book somewhere of lessons learned from that event, which tells people what they can do. But from that point on, there was a lot of, almost everything was delayed, and it got reviewed to an nth degree. I want to give plenty of time here to ask questions or whatever else, but I'm going to briefly go through this other. Most of you are familiar. Just to talk briefly about the coverage of this break-in, which occurred last year. Sunday will be the 1-year anniversary of that event, which has been a huge, huge deal at Y12. There's been, I think most people probably know, if they don't know the details, they probably know as much as they want to know. This is an interesting guy. I can't remember, it was John something or other, whatever. He was there. I find this interesting. He was there. The plowshares, and I don't know if for those of you who are familiar with the plowshare movement, the loosely grouped type of of protests and actions. They do actions and infiltrations, things they do. He was at the original one in 1980, whatever, King of Prussia, in which they broke into a GE facility and poured blood. It was the very first one. This guy, he was one of the members of the Plowshare Aid, or I can't remember if that's the title, that may not be correct. And I can't even remember his name. It was John, I've got his name somewhere. Anyway, but he said that day, I asked him of all things because we were talking about that period. And I said, and we were at Y12, they were having a reunion of that group at Maryville College, and then they came over for a protest at Y12, so almost all those people were there. And I asked him that day, and this has been a few years ago, and I said, it's 2 years ago, maybe it's 3 now, could this happen at Y12? And do you think, no, I asked him, do you think you could do this? Do you think you could get into Y12? And I was probably like everybody else, so there's no way in hell. And he just absolutely, I mean, without, breaks, said yes, no question. He said no question, that they could just walk in. Because that's what they did at the GD facility. They literally just walked, they blended in as they walked in and did a diverting, whatever else. They didn't do it by night. They walked in actually in with the rush hour, whatever, at the facility. They were able to get by without the things, get back to the facility. But he said it, and I reported it at the time, but I didn't believe it. And then I did notice, though, later on that it actually occurred. People have seen this probably a trillion times. That some of you may not be familiar with this. This actually is because we walked there. This actually is where the protesters actually came into Y12. This is a huge field. There's a subdivision back over here, a church where they stop and park the thing. But this actually is where they pretend like I have one of those things. Actually, there's one right up there. I did that because I went up there with over the year to see if a report was true that there was actually still a break in the fence that they had cut, and there was, and that later was repaired. But this was 9 months after the event that breach in the fence was still. This is the perimeter fence, mind you, and I know Y12 folks want to make a big distinction between the perimeter fence and the Titus fences that they also cut through later on. But they walked through there, and if nothing else, walking up there and seeing that fence line, which is part way up Pine Ridge here, and Y12, of course, is on the other side. Walking up there does give you some appreciation for these people doing this in the middle of the night. And at the time, an 82-year-old nun walking through there, that is steep when you get into there. To climb up, and if we didn't take the exact route, we took a very similar route, actually had to hold on to a tree and pull yourself up. It is so steep that you can't just walk up. You can't just walk up the ridge at that point. It's very wooded. It's not easy. I can't even imagine doing it at night. Well, because I don't like ticks and whatever else, but but yeah. Anyway, if nothing else, I give you appreciation for back in that area to go see exactly how people did enter that plant. I think people have probably seen these more than they care to see. Here we talk about this. This is another wonderful event that's one of the pride and joys of Y12. This is the guy who, John Crackers, used to work at Y12, and then he left and he went to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and now he's a corporate fellow there. And of course, when you leave Y12 and you go to Ornell, you disappear. Yeah, I know that didn't happen to some people. The explanation for this were always very interesting at the time. These were the other ones I brought for that. I didn't know if those would show up, so I like to bring these two and show them a little bit. The word circulated on this pretty quickly when it appeared in one of the Y12 publications, because everybody's like, well, what's odd about this picture? Why is President Bush talking to himself? Or why is he? How did they get this? And I don't remember the exact explanation. There's probably somebody in this room who can give that exact explanation of why they did it, why they photoshopped him out. I think something else. We wanted to put the emphasis on the president. We didn't want to clutter everything up. So you kind of have to be careful these days with the whole photoshopping thing. I didn't, because we're talking about Y12. I didn't bring up the classics from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, in which they actually put clothing on a woman to cover herself, even though she was in a photograph. This artist at the Orangery, in which I've shown that before too, in which they they actually had a photograph of some new corporate fellows that were posing with O&L Director Tom Mason for their photographs, and in the background was this mural in which there was a woman with a dress and her breast exposed or whatever, and they thought that might be kind of sensitive, so they photoshopped her dress putting over. They changed the artwork. The worst thing about it was that they sent me the original one and then tried to get it back. And said, we want to sell this. I said, not only I said, no, we're not going to use that. I said, first off, I didn't know sure we're doing it. Don't ever send me a Photoshop photograph again. Or if you do, at least warn, tell us how you've doctored these photographs. Small taters, I'm sorry, but I divert. Coverage, I got a wake-up call like everybody else, although my call was in the daylight. It wasn't like somebody in the middle of the night. This is what I did that day. It was Saturday morning. The wonderful thing about having a blog now, which I self-publish and do whatever and have it right there, is that we have a real-time publishing capability. So I was able to sit in my wonderful kitchen here. You can see with the view of the pond, and it's nice, huh? Probably just these big bucks. I did my first. I think the first can release sometimes after 10 or whatever. My first was at 11. And I did 10 before the day was out. And there was a lot of information floating out there. First off, because you can imagine the protest group was very anxious in some ways once this thing was out there to get their information out there. And it was surprisingly spot on in terms of, and I find that generally true with groups that are doing such things such as this. Their information it turns out in this case to be absolutely their testimony. They didn't need anybody to testify to whatever they're doing, because you saw in their conviction in their trial, every last detail they reported was an admission, and that's basically what it was. So there was a lot of information out there. Oddly enough, only it was later in the day which we were able to learn. At first, it was just the first initial notice from Y12 was just that there had been a building defaced, and it didn't say which one. And of course, that just scared the heck out of people like historian Ray Smith. They had somehow gotten into New Hope Pond and gotten into the history area. So, other people were. But later in the day, I heard, oddly enough, from some activists that they had actually done this and put blood on the highly enriched uranium materials facility. That wasn't actually confirmed by the National Nuclear Security Administration until the next day. But when I heard just the area in which they reached, obviously that changed the whole context. When you're first getting something that simply says a building has been defaced at Y12, to suddenly your understanding, if you've covered Y12 for 30 years, you suddenly understand immediately the significance, the unprecedented nature of people actually entering your PIDES area. Some of these other things that I put together sort of earlier, just kind of this is what I did for a thing I wrote, or did for a thing. Again, down at the bottom, I did this thing, 40 knots for you. Again, I still find it difficult to try to get information. You're always hopeful that you can actually get real-time information in a real way from the representatives of the U.S. government. It's just not always the case. I don't like to file FOIAs for every common little detail, but sometimes you have to, and even if it comes 6 months later, it needs to be reported. I think the trend is such that you'll definitely see more and more of that unless things change in some way I don't foresee. Reminders to myself, sort of, what it looked like that night, probably. Other things that have been coming up since then. There's been a lot of fallout. Trial, good gracious. It's been a lot of stuff. I just want to take questions. If people want to ask them, I've kind of babbled on long enough.
Frank, so you've done a lot of work before you might call this. If you rank the attention in this area as it goes outward to national, on out to the international, how much proliferation of this news event got out there, in your opinion, the attention of domestic and international news, in your opinion? And then a follow-up question to that is why you think about that, is that did you get any recognition of all the hard work that you did before in your line of field?
We had, this obviously was an international, it got international coverage. I mean, the Secretary of Energy spoke, I guess within a month, he was in Vienna. I think he addressed it even there. It got a lot of coverage. You know, let's be honest. This. I mean, in some ways, from a standard of whether it's from the government, the federal government, and their nuclear watch, their nuclear operations, to the whether it's the news media or people or just general interest. This is kind of like a perfect storm in terms of you've got this supposedly invincible, impenetrable facility that stores some of the most coveted materials in the world in terms of highly enriched uranium. You've got a breach of an unprecedented nature, and for gosh sakes, it's not only that. You've got the average age qualifying for Social Security, and it's got an 82-year-old nun doing it, crossing a ridge and doing and cutting through fences. I mean, it almost sounds like. It doesn't sound believable. If the idea of getting into Y-12 didn't sound believable, the way it was done seemed even less so. So it got a lot of coverage. It has waned a bit. To be honest, it continues. There's been a continuous stream of stuff. I mean, not only did you go from you had to start in the late July to the there was almost it was a story. Stories, multiple stories a day in terms of all the reports that were coming out, the investigations, the contract terminations. Again, the impacts of this are incredible. Within my scope, you had contractors losing jobs. You had people, very well thought of individuals, executives losing their jobs. If they didn't lose their jobs in the sense that they were unemployed, but they lost their coveted positions. It was a big deal. It got coverage in everything. Some covered it more than others. I mean, clearly, in terms of continuing exposure, when the Washington Post published a 6-page section on the thing, and that clearly had an audience that maybe hadn't been fully tapped before. It's been covered a lot of way. You know, recognition. I don't know. You know, yeah. I mean, some people care more than others. I measure demographics of who's reading. For instance, I monitor traffic very closely on my blog in terms of where it's coming from, who's been employed, in terms of, and it would definitely spike. The month of August 2012 is the biggest month ever for visitation on that blog. I'm not going to tell you the numbers; those are proprietary. I get to say that at least once a year. But yes, it was a big traffic, and yeah, I personally get recognition. I mean, from places I care most about, but I'm not a big awards person. So, yeah. Bill.
Well, I just wondered what you thought of the present situation where practically all classified information should be front page news. And in other words, we seem to be doing something that for 50 years we never did, which is to let classified information become public.
You didn't forget about the Pentagon Papers, did you?
Well, good point. Good point. So I was just wondering what your feeling was on this. I mean, your talk is about the way the secrets of Oak Ridge Y-12 were secured. As far as I know, there's never really been a very large security breach in the whole DOE system. There's a few cases, but not very many. So it's been a very effective system that's been devised and carried on for 50 years. What is your feeling about this mood in the country that NSA is a bad person, that they obviously infringed on the rights of...
You said NSA, right? Not NSA.
NSA.
Okay. Well, yeah, yeah, there's the whole Julian Assange thing, the Ed Snowden thing, all that, I mean, it's obviously a big deal. What mostly I was talking about wasn't about just about the Y-12 or Oak Ridge people making sure they protect their classified information. I'm talking about a huge battle over unclassified information. Much of which is sanitized to the point that I get versions that are sanitized, and over the next week there'll be a very rich material, the same topic in the Y-12 report. I think, there's just not even a consistency there. What I think, I don't really have the current state about WikiLeaks and all. I mean, I don't really have. I watch it. You're always concerned in this business about privacy and about withholding information. Especially you worry about people. Much of my career certainly has been spent in search of information, but I don't really have anything terribly insightful I don't think to answer that in terms of what I think. I'm going to say some, oh yeah, they're my heroes. I mean, that's not, but it's more complicated certainly than the extreme breaching of the nation's secrets and the fight for basic information about government operations. I mean, right now we're in a situation where there's a $22 billion management contract that's up for that's being protested. It's up for bids, and we've got a virtual shutdown on all information regarding it, even as to when any kind of timetables or anything else. It's just very, very difficult. You can always say what we think, which is what's being said. We can more effectively resolve this contract situation and get things going if we don't discuss it. Well, yeah, that's true about almost everything. I mean, every city manager will probably say, we could really do our business a whole heck of a lot better if we just did it back here in the smoke-filled room, if we didn't actually have to tell you what we were doing. So I don't have a lot of sympathy. I really think, and this is just my impression, that sometimes we have federal and contractor officials who sort of take personal ownership of government information, public information, and treat it such, and that's disturbing.
Freedom of Information Act?
Well, that's the other alternative to go to, and sometimes that can be a very onerous process.
You think that's worked out pretty well, Freedom of Information Act?
I admire some of the people who work in that. No, it's horrific. If they really cared about it, they'd double the staff and get things out on a more timely way. Instead of using this fallback line, which is for almost every response, that we have a backlog. I've had stuff they've released to me in 2 days, but I still got the obligatory letter beforehand telling me it'll be at least 30 days till I have a chance to look at it. I mean, even though they gave it to me 2 days later, it's because they do that. They automatically now tell you they have a backlog that says we will not be able to meet the law, which requires a response. So, yeah, don't mean to fault FOIA. And the people who work in the FOIA process are good people. They really try. Honestly, most of the people I've dealt with, and you can call them up and talk to them and say, hey, I've got a request, and what in the heck is going on? And they'll actually treat you like, it's a good process, but it's incredibly flawed.
So Frank, who's going to win the contract?
So somebody's already won the contract. The question is, will it be upheld? I can only make enemies that way. I mean, not that, I may have a few anyway, but I don't know. I don't have any inside information there, but how many significant, there's been, I think, one at Hanford, but there haven't been a whole lot of large contracts that have successfully been overturned. Whatever. There's been some, but it's not common. Yes.
See, can you discuss the ethical dilemmas that follow you around?
I think it's something that weighs on you all the time. Absolutely. More specifically, more so than ever, because the news world is shrinking, the staffs are shrinking. You don't have as many fallback people. Say you don't have many safety nets. You've got people like me reporting in real time by myself, self-publishing out there under our newspaper's banner, and that takes a lot of trust in the people, in the fact that my editors are trusting me to be out there reporting in a real-time way without even anyone reviewing it. Now, it gets reviewed later, and the good thing about being online is that if you see things, whether it's timeless, whatever, you can get there and you can get them fixed, and you can get those things changed. But in terms of ethics, there's a whole lot of ethical challenges all the time. You'd have to be more specific. Is there something particular you're thinking about?
I was just saying, you have, on one hand is the American public, and the other hand is the American government, of which you serve both parties. So it's a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that. I don't never see that from as much from the ethical standpoint. I'm not being forced to choose. I think there's just simply you go about doing the best you can in the context of, but it's certainly trying to be fair.
Well, you control the flow of information from one to the other.
Yes.
You control that valve.
Yes.
So I guess that's the we each have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't take it lightly.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I'm just trying to think of a particular ethical challenge. My biggest concern almost always is to get it right. I don't use a lot. I mean, I do occasionally write from first-hand knowledge or things I've seen, but I don't use a lot of unnamed sources. I'm different than some. I don't want to be critical of anybody because I think everybody is trying to do the best job they can. I personally think it's worth the extra effort to try to get someone to speak on the record with their name associated. I think it's much more important what someone said with their name there than to say something occurred without. I'm not saying you don't have to on occasion, you do. It's some of the most important journalism in this country has been done without the name, using unnamed sources. So it's just, most of my work I try very hard not to.
Frank, we probably have time for one more question.
Sure.
So let me just try to flip it. Could you, or a journalist, you're ready to say, plausibly, part of the reason for that break-in was the way that the DU was controlling information, that people are afraid to come forward, or you can't develop stories, or like Sapphire, or something that people might have been, why were all these things broken so long? Nobody knew about it, and that could be a failure of the press, or not. Failure is too strong, but was there a shortfall there?
And I've talked to you about that, and I know that's something that you pursue in a very strong way in terms of whether the government has let down by not having the proper avenues in place for people to speak freely within the government, or at least within the constraints of classification and other things, speaking freely. All I can say in terms of making choices and trying to do it is that of doing the right thing and trying to cover the right things, trying to ask the right questions, is that, or what stories to do, whether I do I think covering this will lead to this and perhaps save lives or do whatever. It's more often the case, I give a lot of, we have to make choices every single day in terms of what we're going to cover because there's a trillion stories to be had, and I've got usually many in my briefcase that are waiting to be done, and I may have the information, don't have a chance to write them. And it's just tough choices. We don't always make the right choice. There's no question that I've turned my back, not in a physical way, but just turned my back on stories that turned out to be very important. I can think of stories in which I found myself a year later reporting stuff and knowing that I had almost all the ingredients of that sitting with me the entire time, and I just had not taken the time because I got diverted onto something else. Whether it's low-hanging fruit and the stupid press release of the day, I probably ignored some really important news and didn't do it in a timely way. And do I regret that? Sure. But I'm not going to tell you what it is because then I would really be hounded.
All right. Well, let's thank Frank one more time.